Dr. Mishra, should we start now?
I think you can start. You can start.
Yeah. Good afternoon to all. Greetings from Kasyap Foundation. Kasyap Foundation is a multidimensional non-profit service organization. Its New Delhi office works on issues related to poor and poverty alleviation and strives to make a poverty-free society. The foundation strongly believes that poverty is a manifestation of deprivation of basic human needs such as housing, water and sanitation, health, food and nutrition, education and livelihoods. It functions through in-house team of researchers and a network of scholars from reputed academic institutions. It has undertaken various projects and research papers of policy importance on its key thematic areas. The organization is continuously engaging different stakeholders to create dialogue for exploring a pragmatic way out of poverty alleviation. One of the key activities of Kasyap Foundation is Poverty Discourse, which is a platform to deliberate upon various issues pertaining to poverty. We are pleased to invite you to join Kasyap Foundation's 58th Poverty Discourse on poverty and its associated deprivation and exploration. I have the privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Uday Shankar Mishra. Dr. Uday Shankar Mishra, a PhD in Population Studies from International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai, is currently professor at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala. During his 3 decades of teaching and research experience, he has contributed in diversified areas like poverty, aging, health, nutrition, as well as population policy and program evaluation. He has served in various capacities of guiding scientific research in social sciences. Professor Mishra has a number of national and international publications to his credit. The recent works of him include the co-edited book titled Demographic and Development Divide in India and the paper Sustaining Sustainable Development Goals, published in prestigious journal Economic and Political Weekly. His publications on poverty that reflect his expertise in this field are Migration and Urban Poverty in India, some preliminary observations, Defining Poor to Defining Rich, Gauging the Middle Class in India, Is Poverty Comparable Across Varying Size of Population among Indian states, and is the recent reduction in India's poverty inclusive? Poor in midst of non-well poor, ill-being implications of poverty. These are some of his important publications on poverty, and is worthy to mention here because today's talk is basically focusing on poverty and poverty alleviation. Professor Mishra's scholastic distinctions include Take Me Fellow in the Department of Population and International Health, Harvard School of Public Health, Boston, USA, during 2003 and 5. Associate member of Southampton Statistical Sciences Research Institute, University of Southampton, UK. Expert group member to review and draft handbook on designing of household sample survey at the United Nations Statistics Division, New York. With this brief introduction, I would like to request Professor Mishra to start his talk, and I request the participants of this webinar that all the question answers can be at the end of his talk. Thank you. Yes, Professor Mishra.
Good afternoon to all. Let me begin by thanking the Kasyap Foundation for giving the opportunity to share my views on this particular contentious topic of poverty and relative deprivations of poverty, dimensions of deprivations of poverty. Also, I am particularly thankful to Dr. Lalit for persuading me to give this lecture for the benefit of a large number of people who are concerned about working on poverty. And poverty is not less of a contentious topic today, particularly in the post-pandemic situation. With this, relatively important issue of poverty and poverty in India and its trends of reduction or the trends that is reflected in recent times, I want to deliver this talk by considering a topic titled, as Lalit rightly mentioned, is the poverty and associated deprivation and exploration. So let me share my screen so that you can. Yeah, are you able to see? Is it visible? It's okay?
No, it's not there. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah.
It come, Lalit, it's fine?
Yeah, it has come. Yeah.
Okay. So let me begin by saying that why poverty and development discourse is because levels of poverty in the presence of poverty in the development discourse is levels of poverty, its impact on growth, inclusivity, and development quality. This is very well known. Poverty reduction has been a concern, and the efficacy of a singular approach, is every one poor person identified correctly, has been the contention all the time. When poverty refers to a broader definition of compromise in basic minimum standard of living, such minimum has never attained consensus. Primarily, the basic two concerns in conceptualization of poverty is, everyone knows, is that to identify who is poor, and again to measure and describe this particular aspect with accommodation of all possible qualifiers of necessary axioms on one hand and maximum extent of match with the prominent domains of deprivation. This is the reason that poverty prevails in the development discourse broadly. So I'm just beginning to provoke certain questions about reading of poverty, some common concerns and contradictions. What is that? Exactly, if you look at the most popular measure of headcount ratio of poverty, over time has been declining. But this is along with the fact that the number of poor, if you count, they are rising. This is a primary contradiction. Second, there is also people's concern and anxiety about whether there is experience of economic growth. Does it imply a kind of a commensurate reduction in poverty? Again, when we talk about varying dimensions of deprivations which are associated with poverty, they are nutrition, education, health, employment, and many others. One doesn't find that they are actually systematically split between the poor and the non-poor, because do these domains of deprivation actually split very, very systematically between the poor and the non-poor? Again, should there be a recognition of, we know headcount ratio is a level of poverty. Should the recognition of a level of poverty be different from that of burden of poverty, which I will elaborate during my lecture? What is the difference between level and burden? Again, inspection of poverty trends has been a common phenomenon, but is it sensitive to aspects of inclusion is a further question. The conflict between moneymetric and calorimetric assessment of poverty has been an age-old debate. And finally, what to infer from a poverty growth inequality triangle, which people discuss and engage with, whether growth leads to reduction in poverty, whether rising inequality is inherent in or affects poverty reduction. These questions are in this discourse of poverty growth inequality triangle. Let me begin with an exposition of poverty trend in India so that the audience know that what is our whole story of pre-independence till now. This is basically a chronological outlook of poverty trends and poverty understanding in our country. Starting with the first description by Dadabhai Naroji, you have national planning committees, you have Bombay Plan of 1944. This is just for the sake of an intro. I give you a detail of the chronology, which is working group of 62 was first set up. Then you had Dandekar and Rath committee of 71. You had projection of minimum needs and effective consumption demand. Lakdawala expert group, Tendulkar group, these are all well-known things. But why I'm giving it? Because this forms the current state of discourse on poverty. These are its background by which we have reached an understanding of poverty today with all this background of different chronology of discussion which has undergone changes and other things. Now, what is this changes of poverty in India? Just to reflect, I wanted to give you a kind of a pictorial presentation where between 93, 94 and 2011-12, this India map describes that actually there has been substantial reduction in poverty. And what is that reduction? Headcount ratio of poverty has declined substantially. The red zones have converted themselves to yellow and green zones, which you can see. So this is our conviction that we have actually reduced poverty substantially. If that is so, then the whole story of poverty actually is connected like this. There is whole discourse on poverty linking with nutrition, linking with health, linking with inequality, linking with growth, linking with employment, linking it with economy as a whole, linking with inclusiveness, and finally education. Why I say this? This is what is the entire literature on poverty. If you look at, everybody takes a particular stand and then works on it. How is poverty linked with inequality? How is poverty linked with ill health? How is it linked with undernourishment? How it is linked with lack of education? How it is linked with the economic performance of a country? These are phenomena which people do work on. I have brought for you 4 relevant points for consideration today in this talk. Those relevant points are the conflict between moneymetric and calorimetric assessment of poverty, A. Second, is poverty reduction inclusive? Does aspects of inclusion get accounted for in reading trends in poverty? I mean to say that when we see reduction or trends in poverty, do we actually take into account the inclusionary aspect of reduction in poverty? Third, a differentiation between levels and borders of poverty. And finally, a multidimensional poverty. As is multidimensional poverty, therefore, is the answer? If yes, should this measurement be as simplistic as it is made out to be? These are the 4 relevant points of consideration in today's talk. Let us begin with calorimetric and moneymetric poverty debate. Calorimetric and moneymetric poverty debate actually is surrounded by this fact that welfare measures such as per capita consumption, poverty line, and deciding and linking per capita consumption to the calorimetric conversion often puts us in trouble in the poverty discourse. Why it is relevant? Because there is no consensus and comparison of poverty estimates, and there are disagreements with all forms of deprivation on one hand. But here it comes to, if we link with calorie also, we get contradictions. For instance, calorie compromise among the poor need not necessarily be understood as an inadequacy of affordability of food expenditure, but it is also due to the consumption choices that they make. And this has been found by one of my own work, which I published, where I titled it that inadequacy is undernourishment due to inadequacy or due to choice. Often you find that there are households with lesser food expenditure but calorie compliant, and more food expenditure but not calorie compliant. This divide in calorie undernourishment due to inadequacy or choice responds to the magnitude of poverty. With larger magnitude of poverty, calorie compromise due to choice rises, although share due to inadequacy dominates. Now, studies opine that there is a puzzling relationship between consumption expenditure and calorie intake that is already existing. And it also states that observation indicate that rising incomes enable the population to diversify patterns. These structural changes in occupational pattern in agriculture, such as owing to mechanization, reduce the need for calories. That's the argument made by Banerjee and Duflo. Dayton and Rees, on account of analyzing our NSSO consumption expenditure survey, have also argued that actually calorie intake cannot be a static or a point of determining undernourishment, because this keeps changing. And study by 2007 by Utsa Patnaik opines that decline in calorie intake is owing to the impoverishment of major share of the population on account of squeezing of budgets towards non-food expenditure, specifically healthcare. Given this controversial stance, I just put in front of you two graphs which actually reflect a drastic difference which you can imagine. That if you compare monometric poverty of 11-12 with monometric of 2004-5 and try to see comparison of Indian states, then you find many of the states in monometric calculation of poverty have done much better, because monometric measurement performance is better. But if you look at calorimetric graph of the same thing, you find a different contrast. This itself actually puts the point that calorimetric and the conflict between monometric and calorimetric measure of poverty. Having said that, there is this table where actually monometric and calorimetric deprivation has been tabulated for urban and rural areas as regard undernourishment and well-nourishment. UN and WN stands for undernourishment and well-nourishment. And this is a joint distribution of 2 rounds of surveys of NSSO, where you have 61st and 68th round. Look at the contrast, and you find that there are people who are undernourished and poor. There are also people non-poor and undernourished. This joint occurrence of non-poor and undernourished probability is 0.52. Joint occurrence, this is a joint distribution. Don't try to read it as frequency. And if you look at it in that perspective, it is not that poverty is directly associated with undernourishment in a systematic manner, but undernourishment is in both segments of poor and the non-poor. This reflects that whether we should be careful when we actually compare monometric assessment and calorimetric assessment of deprivation in India as regard undernourishment. Now I am coming to the second question that I raised, is about poverty and inclusivity. While characterization of poverty, as you know, poverty among caste, poverty among occupation group, poverty over regions, poverty across many other characteristics is examined often, but the aspect of inclusion is overlooked. What I mean by inclusion? Here, the inclusivity refers to the representational principle to be adopted in examining horizontal inequality. Let me elaborate a little bit on what is this representational principle stands for. This representational principle stands for when we observe or try to assess a decline in quantum of poverty. This decline is happening across characteristics groups. These characteristics groups have their own representation in the population share. For instance, you take group A and group B, there is a population share. And the reduction of poverty for group A, the reduction of poverty for group B, is it in keeping with their share or not, is what the representational principle guides about or talks about. This measure is adopted to read inclusion, which is called relative deprivation index. On account of this, I had actually contributed a paper in terms of examining inclusivity, or is poverty reduction in India inclusive or not. This is the result of that, which actually across states, I've just given an illustration of rural disadvantage. You can do it by caste. It has been done by other attributes as well. It can be done. But 2004-5 to 2009-10, you have the head count ratio difference. This difference can be told as there is a decline, there is an increase. So you know that this is the quantum decline in head count ratio of poverty. But the relative deprivation index computed for rural areas tells that how much of inclusion of rural feature is there in the reduction of this poverty. And these values which you see in decimal points are called the relative disadvantage, the extent of non-inclusion rather, that in terms of reduction in poverty, poverty reduction could be more in urban, less in rural, whereas rural population can be larger and urban population can be smaller. This says that reduction in poverty is not keeping with the share of the characteristics in the population. And this demonstration can be done for any kind of measure, provided we are talking about characteristics aspect of poverty reduction. Then I come to the third one called poverty inequality growth triangle, which is poverty is measured by the absolute poverty head count index, the proportion of below a particular poverty, that is in international standard $1 a day. Inequality refers to disparity in relative income, and growth refers to percentage change in mean welfare level. These are three well-defined aspects, but they have a connection that people engage with. And what does that connection look like? They look like absolute poverty and poverty reduction is implied from the distributional changes on one hand, and the overall, that means the size of the cake as well as the distribution share of the cake, both are important in terms of affecting poverty. So poverty growth inequality triangle is a very well-known arena where actually people have engaged and come to a conclusion that poverty reduction is does necessarily require growth, does necessarily require reduction in inequality, but the extent. The more important pertinent question is that, does growth give a commensurate reduction in poverty? Does reduction in inequality give commensurate implications for poverty? That is what is the consensus question. It's not about they do or not, but how much. Given this understanding, let us move to the question that I raised, another one which is very, very important, is about levels of poverty versus burden of poverty. This is a very interesting dimension which has never been discussed at length in the poverty discourse. Why? Levels and burdens are very simple. Levels is your head count ratio of poverty, the number of poor people. So in a population, poor and non-poor exist together. The burden is the one which is the assessment of affecting redistribution in a manner that all the poor people can be brought out of poverty. It is derived based on the share of the population from whom transfer can be materialized to compensate the entire poverty gap. This is called the burden. And such a transfer should qualify rank preserving transfer, in the sense this redistribution should not affect the rank of the people in consumption hierarchy. This is an assumption. And on computation of these two features of poverty, that is levels and burden, what do we find is in this table. This table shows to you that Indian states rural according to poverty head count ratio and burden. Look at it. I have described the poverty burden in different ranges as low, medium, high, very high, and extreme. Similarly, the head count ratio, this is the left-hand side, is the level of poverty and distributed Indian states. Here, one curiosity comes that which one is better, which one is ideal, low burden, low level, or high burden, high level. In fact, preferably, low burden, low level is better. Low level is always better, and if it is accompanied with low burden, further better. But if you look at the distribution you can see that there are states where actually levels of poverty are reasonably high, but burden is not that high. What does that imply? It implies that there are poor people and we have mechanism of redistribution which will not make reduction in poverty impossible or addressing poverty decline impossible. But you have two states at the last corner, which you see, Bihar and Odisha. They are in high. They have a level high as well as burden high. What does that imply? These are states relatively poor where actually burden also is high. You have to affect the redistribution from a whole lot of people to address the gap that is in poverty gap. Therefore, this contrast of level and burden of poverty is one dimension which needs attention in the poverty discourse. I here write the conclusion of this in India. It describes the group of states with varying levels and burden of poverty. Is low ideal or high ideal is a question. Optimism exists when there is a low situation. However, lower burden makes achieving reduction of poverty more realistic than otherwise. That means the take-home message is that levels are not the only thing. Levels needs to be read along with the burden for a robust comparison of poverty trends. Now let us move to some relevant conclusions. It is apparent that the process for establishing poverty line estimation has been in constant flux, as I have been talking for the last few minutes. The use of a minimum adequate norm for nutrition as a key criterion for defining poverty line has come in for criticism, we know very well, and therefore we have to look for some alternative. We have to look for other domains of conformity with that poverty. Shortcomings of poverty measurement by various committees became apparent after questions arose whether poverty is only about consumption. Is poverty about only consumption? Because we are basing on consumption. Poverty encompasses other factors such as poor health, malnutrition, lack of basic facilities like clean water, electricity, poor quality of work, and limited education access. Multidimensional poverty, character of poverty, has received strong appreciation in recent times. It leads towards an attempt at combining deprivation in multiple domains such as education, health, sanitation, etc. to designate poor. So the question is multidimensional poverty the alternative? Let's go ahead and see what it does. This is the pictorial of your multidimensional poverty, which is a global effort which is going on for countries, for India also, that global MPI. There are 3 domains. Each domain have different number of indicators. First 2 domains have 2 indicators each, and the third domain has 6 indicators. And this is the weighing structure on which your global multidimensional poverty index is computed. Let me say what is my reservation on this. Multidimensional poverty, although a very ideal measure to be taken as an alternative, here comes the simplicity outweighing adequacy. Aggregating 3 domains with varying components, first place, and then it has equal weights. Is it acceptable? That is a contention. Does it consider interdependence across domains? Because considering many domains is fine, but interdependence has to be accounted for. The complexity lies in considering poor in how many domains and which one. How many and which one, please underline, that is very important. Essentially, this measurement involves recognition of all combinations of deprivation and their prevalence needs to be aggregated. Finally, what this multidimensional poverty computation and assessment leads towards, ideally, it needs to present a visualization of the experienced pathway between all deprived to non-deprived. That means if you are considering 3 domains, in all the 3 domains, there can be households which are not deprived. And there can be households which are deprived in all. So the pathway visualization becomes more crucial than merely aggregating them in a simpler way. That's why I say simplicity outweighs adequacy. Now comes that what are the cautions that we can take in reading poverty? There are many cautions that is required in reading poverty. Blanket comparison of levels of poverty may not be ideal unless otherwise read in cognizance of the implied ill fare. Why do I say that? I say that because levels of poverty is a simple measure, and its implied ill fare are very circumstantial. Its implied ill fare depends on its level. Its implied ill fare depends on the kind of intervention that exists, many other things. Therefore, a comparison of level of poverty should be in keeping with what is its implied ill fare. Second, are poor everywhere having similar facets of deprivation? If no, then the domain of deprivation becomes more important than the level of poverty determined with a common yardstick. You cannot just have levels of poverty that dictates everything, but also its associated deprivations. And those could be very different in different population, different circumstances, and different across various regions. Designating common characteristics of poverty in terms of livelihood dependence and endowment is perhaps more important than assessment of its level alone, because common characteristics of poverty of livelihood dependence I refer to as to who are the people who get commonly designated as poor, what are their means of livelihood. Second, what are their tangible and intangible endowments. Should poverty levels be compared? Simply 40% poverty versus 10% poverty? I take a very contentious position. I say that its implied ill fare can be conditioned by its level. In fact, I say to the contrary, a higher level of poverty may not have that ill fare vis-a-vis a relatively lower level of poverty. A lower level of poverty has more ill fare. Why? I should make my position very clear here. That lower level of poverty is that less number of poor people live along with non-poor people who are more in count. They negotiate the same market. They negotiate the same public space. Obviously, they are confronted with more ill fare than a population where they are relatively higher in proportion. This is not to say that high levels of poverty are good, but levels of ill fare has to be adjusted with the situation. Finally, other cautions which are required in reading poverty is that trends in poverty reduction should necessarily be qualified with the necessary inclusion criteria. Why? Because inclusion criteria is important to dictate whether poverty reduction has been inclusive. In keeping in mind, there are three dimensions to this inclusion. One is called focus, one is called narrowing gaps, another is called inclusion by itself. And focus means the characteristics that shares larger share of poverty. In that group, the reduction has to be more. And that is what is called focus. Poverty reduction needs to be contrasted with rising average standards of living, always. Because if there is no poverty reduction with rising standard of living, there is no inclusion, very clear. Otherwise, there needs to be a verification as to whether the fixed poverty line on the basis of which we determine the levels of poverty is responsive to the changing level of consumption overall. Finally, whether it be temporal or cross-sectional comparison of levels of poverty, it needs to qualify inclusion, focus, as well as levels of ill fare. I stop here. Thank you for your attention. Questions and queries are highly appreciated.
Thank you, Professor Mishra. A number of important points Professor Mishra has elaborated. One of them is the aspects of inclusiveness is ignored often. Second, was relevant, and conclusion he has said is multidimensional poverty is the answer. And domain of deprivation is important, needs to be focused. With this thing, I request if any questions are from the audience, please put it for us so that So Mr. can answer it.
Hello, this is Kesari Prasad, working here in Chetanya Foundation as research associate. Thank you, sir, for such a informative lecture lecture on poverty and deprivations. Uh, uh, I have a query, sir. Like when we see in global hunger index, now India has slipped to 101st position in 2021 from the 94th position in uh, previous year in 2020. And on the second side, other side, we see that survey by NFHS and National Nutrition Survey and Rapid Survey on Children. All surveys are showing that the uh, malnutrition has decreased. So I find, sir, there is a contradiction. Like at one side, this India is um, going down in the global hunger index, and on the other side, these surveys showing that situation is improving in terms of malnutrition. So I need your comment, sir, over it. And second question is, what is the role of organizations working outside the government body uh, to tackle the poverty, and how they will do it? Thank you.
Thank you for your query. Let me first begin with the first one, and which has been actually making rounds recently in all circles as to whether India should be worried about the hunger index ranking or not. To that effect, I also wrote a piece in Economic Times. Let me tell you very categorically. These indices or the global indices, whether it be global hunger index, whether it is gender parity index, whether it is any form of indices, their objective is particularly to position countries or units in comparative perspective. But those comparisons are influenced by the content that they take. They take 4 domains in global hunger index. The domains are population level calorie undernourishment, the child mortality, child stunting, and another indicator is about I think is anthropometry or something like that. 4 domains. These 4 domains which they are taking, in that the more consensus and one can disagree with always is population level calorie undernourishment. As I was talking in my lecture also, calorie undernourishment to determine at a population level is a very conflicting one. We do not have information. We have information from the household. We make adult equivalence. Then we try to see its robustness against BMI, then try to aggregate it. That is sometimes not very much comparable across situations. And second thing, global data sets might give you something which makes no big deal of a difference because they can make things global without a touch of local reality at all. Because these kind of exercises are merely global. And I think I have opined in my piece in Economic Times that global hunger index is not the one which India should be worried about. Whether the position goes up or position comes down. The trend inspection in the outcomes of nutrition over all the surveys do not show that we are on a decline or we are on a deterioration. We are definitely not very well placed due to the pandemic, but overall trend doesn't look pessimistic. Your second question is that non-government organizations should do what about poverty?
Yes, sir.
You see, governmental efforts and interventions are always to the order of alleviating poverty by provisioning. whether you talk about provisioning food, provisioning security, provisioning NREGA, job, or anything in terms of provisioning.
Yes.
But one component which government agencies do not, or perhaps not explicitly do, is the component of enabling. Provisioning is a very temporary thing. You can give me food if I'm hungry. If you can give me job when I'm jobless, okay? This you can provide for. But enabling is a sustaining one. When we say that provisioning and enabling component, in enabling component, it is not the government. It is the non-government organization who should audit it, take account of it, go behind it. In terms of provisioning, there can be improvement happening to people. But in the enabling component, and let me make it explicit what I mean by enabling. Education. Suppose a kind of living they had that has improved in terms of the housing condition. You have an enabling environment which is improving, then you can say this poverty reduction will sustain. Otherwise, people will be coming out of poverty and falling into poverty. So unfortunately, the enabling domain actually draws less attention than the provisioning. Okay? Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Is there any question? Any other person wants to speak? Raise question. Is Dr. Balakrishna, you want to have any question?
Sir, I have one more query, sir.
Okay.
You talked about, sir, calorie metric and money metric regarding the estimation of poverty. So, sir, there is problem as you discussed about if we are taking uh, uh, solely money metric or calorie metric. So, in your opinion, sir, what would be the best way for the best way of methodology to take consideration in poverty estimation?
Well, I mean, what I was saying is that the approach that we are taking to conversion of the required minimum calorie into money terms and then decide a poverty line. And we are not sure that what are the amount of threshold calories that is required, because that keeps on changing according to the characteristics and functioning of individuals. It is always better to always, I say in my words, that it is not poverty in terms of a cutoff. It is basically determining poverty with all related vulnerabilities. What I actually refer to vulnerability when I refer, it is poverty should be determined on the basis of the extent of resilience, not extent of consumption, not extent of income, not extent of things they have. It is more important to understand poverty in terms of resilience. Resilience means we all have differential capacity to accommodate shocks. You can accommodate shocks of a situation which costs 5 lakhs. You can. There are people who can accommodate shocks till 30 lakhs. We have differential capacity. But there is a minimum shock accommodation capacity, the resilience domain. And that should determine poverty. Then mere consumption or income or calories, that should not. And that is what we should move towards. That is what is making us move towards multidimensional poverty, where actually the dimensions are features of exposition of poverty primarily. And we are trying to actually aggregate them to say this is what poorness is about. So that is getting appreciated because of that. These are the featured exposition of poverty, these deprivations. So these deprivations brought together do represent an alternative to poverty estimate.
Okay, sir.
Is there any question from? Otherwise, we'll close the thing. Professor, I have a question.
Yes, please carry on.
Like, well, looking into many of your publications, I've seen you have also clearly focused many things in the policy implications.
Yes.
So what are in the absence of a proper estimation of poverty, what are the policy implication and programmatic effect? Since you have already said till Rangarajan committee, there has not been any progress after that one.
Yes.
How it has affected the whole policy scenario?
See, the my position on this whole sequential revisions and a kind of modifications of poverty line and bringing conflict between Tendulkar's committee versus Rangarajan committee estimate and all that. We can have debates on whether which estimate represents better. But ultimately, it is identifying poor people on a particular cutoff. According to me, whether that cutoff accommodates many things or not, it is important to know that the forms of deprivation that goes along with poverty do coexist. That is one. That is, there should not be any error of exclusion. They should be included because all forms of deprivation should coexist. One. They may be in different numbers. I mean, all will not be having all deprivations. But in terms of policy, as you asked, because this has become a gimmick number, which people to run econometric exercises with levels of poverty, headcount ratio, or poverty gap or something. But it is very important to check whether poor people whom we obviously say that they're deprived, they have outcomes which are not improving. They may be poor according to some criteria of definition, but do survival affects, do ill health prevails more, do hunger prevails more among the poor. So when it comes to these outcomes, if these outcomes are manifesting itself in the sign of improvement, this automatically dictates that the fact that our computation or fixation of poverty is at fault. And if it exists, then my opinion is that more than a poverty line or a headcount ratio, it is better to know how many households in India do not have water, how many households do not have sufficient wages for food. Better to know that rather than bracketing everybody in the name of poor. In the name of poor, it does not convey anything for intervention. For intervention, what conveys is systematic identification of different forms of deprivation. Systematic identification. And in fact, I must mention in this forum that I do not associate deprivation with any characteristics. Once I know that this much magnitude of people need water, I know that they need safe water, better provide water, and it will have its own welfare. Rather than characterizing them where they are, which caste they are, which religion they are, makes no sense. It is better to identify crucial forms of deprivation, address them gradually. We will have poor people coming out of poverty according to the governmental glory of assessing and making a headcount ratio.
There's one more question.
Yeah.
Like your whole focus of talk was on deprivation.
Yes.
Does this deprivation differ from country to country? Second thing, and time to time. Just for example, what are the areas of deprivation we are discussing before? What are the things in the post-COVID area? Is there any new areas that can be included in the whole category of deprivation?
Dr. Lalit, this question of deprivation in its connotation is relative and circumstantial, both. When I say deprivation, when I say I'm deprived of something, and the extent to which that deprivation gives me ill fare depends on in what I'm deprived. Everything I can be deprived of. I can say I do not have a car is a deprivation for me. And a person says I don't get 2 square meal a day is a deprivation for him. So the deprivation is connotation wise relative. Relative to what? What you are deprived of. So when you say circumstantial deprivation, do change, but the deprivations which actually dictate basic ill fare, they are ill fare, basic ill fare. That means because you cannot make a complete or the optimal life without that, then that deprivation needs to be taken very seriously. For instance, educational deprivation has a very long-term implication. Nutritional deprivation, you may survive, but you have long-term implication. In adulthood, you will be not optimal life. You would have diseases which are chronic nature, which will come because of your childhood undernourishment. So deprivations have to be not seen in common domain that all deprivations are equal. Deprivations implications has to be seen, and the scale of deprivation can also be read in relation to circumstances. As you rightly said, post-COVID, deprivations profile we have to rethink as to what is deprivation in reality. That's true.
So thank you, Professor Mishra,
Yeah.
for such an elaborate, lucid, and well explored area of deprivation. The whole talk justifies the theme which you decided for this ones, and we are all benefited by it. And this will become in a article form published in a book, which we do it in yearly thing. That once the transcriptions are ready, that I will share with you. Then you can have your comments and editing. Then I will. Thank you very much, this thing, and thank you all the participants for your very active participation and so many questions, very relevant questions, and the answers given by the Professor Mishra. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.